Bethany Hughes, Choctaw Hoki. Hi, I'm Bethany Hughes, and I'm a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. I also am an associate professor in the Department of American Culture at the University of Michigan and one of the core faculty member for the Native American Studies program at U of M. It is my honor to be here in the Ann Arbor Public Library that my family and I have enjoyed and benefited from, and always lovely to be on Anishinaabe lands where I live and do my work. So I'm going to share sort of a brief overview of my book, Redface, which you walked by it when you went by. When you came in, this cover art is by a Ho-Chunk artist named Tom Jones, who's out of Wisconsin. He's on faculty at the University of Wisconsin. And it's from a series of images called Cultural Appropriation, where the identical sort of background image is laid over with various indigenous tribal textiles and beadwork and basket weaving and all sorts of different things. The cover is representative of me and the artist and the land where I made the book and the land where the book was made. So on the right, forgive me, Ho-Chunk and Anishinaabe folks, I can't tell the difference between those patterns very well. They're similar. So one of them is a Ho-Chunk pattern for Tom Jones. The other is Anishinaabe because that is the land on which I wrote this book. The bottom left is as close to Lenape as Tom had in his collection. So the book was published by NYU University Press out of Manhattan. So this is the land of where the book was made. And the top right is representative of my nation. It is not a Choctaw traditional pattern, but diamond shape is our most notable shape in our traditional clothing. So that's what it is. I like to talk about that, one, because I love his art and I'm very grateful that he allowed me to use it, and two, because none of that information is anywhere in the book, so you wouldn't know the meaning of it. So bonus points for coming out in person to hear me talk, because now you know something that nobody else knows. In August 2018, I attended the Association for Theater and Higher Education's annual conference in Boston, Massachusetts. As part of the multi-day event, local excursions were available to conference attendees. I organized one to Plymouth Plantation, which is now called Plymouth Patuxet Museums, where we had an Indigenous-focused tour of the living history of the Wampanoag. Another one I attended but did not organize was to the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum. Though the name museum might lead one to believe this was a civic or state-owned property or even a nonprofit organization dedicated to Boston history, instead it is a for-profit, historically based tourist attraction owned by Historic Tours of America. I had been apprised of the interactive and reenactive elements of the museum tour, which included throwing boxes of tea over the side of the replica boat in Boston Harbor, just like those Proto-Americans protesting the British tea tax centuries ago did. I had also been cautioned that museum goers were invited to do this reenactment in Indian costume, wearing feathers. I was eager to witness this red-faced performance by casual tourists desiring some history with their leisure. I imagined that it would be a Plains tribe headdress people could put on before they threw the tea over. I was unprepared, however, for what I encountered. As our group was called to begin the tour experience, I followed a small crowd toward double doors held open by this period-costumed 18th century smiling young man. In his left hand was a satchel full of brown feathers. He offered each museum guest one in case we, quote, needed to disguise ourselves later. I entered the meeting house room after about a dozen others and looked down the rows of benches to find a few other tourists had already chosen to disguise themselves by tucking their feather in the back of their hair or ball cap. I physically recoiled at the sight. I was surprised by my visceral reaction to a simple feather when I had been expecting someone to don a headdress, but I soon collected myself and chose a seat. I looked at the card I was handed by another costumed reenactor, which offered me context and a historical figure to play if I wanted to join in the reenactment spirit. I listened to a rousing speech about tyranny and freedom, setting the scene for our experience as a Tea Party-er, which included a brief nod to the feathers most of us held in our hands or laps. We were informed we would be disguising ourselves as Mohawk. Our midnight protest in the harbor would be strengthened by the admirable qualities of those Native Americans. After that attempt to allay our contemporary consciences of any fear that wearing these feathers might be construed as racist, our group proceeded through the rest of the museum. Our last stop was aboard the replica ship to toss over some tea. Those who wanted, I did not, could lift a small box and throw it over the side of the boat into the water. The rope attached to the box made it easily repeatable action and ensured no actual loss of tea was possible. There was also no tea in the box. Again, we were invited to disguise ourselves, if we wished, before throwing over the tea. Those I saw throw the box over did not wear their feather. In fact, most of the people in our tour group, which was partly, though not all, conference attendees, never put their feather on at all. Shortly thereafter, we were funneled down a gangplank toward a cafe and then into a gift shop full of various tea and patriotism-themed objects to purchase. There was a conveniently placed barrel with slots for recycling the cards and feathers we received for those environmentally minded. However, at each step of the way, along the gangplank, or in the gift shop, or in a trash can, discarded and forgotten feathers lay about. Most notable for me was a family having a snack in the cafe, the young girl wearing 3 feathers tucked into her half ponytail. This was my encounter with red-faced, and what I contend is its most basic form. A performer curated a selection of racialized markers and deployed them in embodied performance, resulting in a legibly Indian figure being perceived by an audience. But, like every other instance of redface, there was more going on than the deceptively simple act of wearing a feather. This question, how do you know when you see an Indian, shapes this project and my research for the past decade. And this moment with a single feather in Boston showed me just how quickly and easily people know how to see and be seen as an Indian. But this question led me to many others that I work to answer in the book. The feather was legible as a marker of Indianness. Why? We were provided minimal instructions on how to wear the feather, but all who wore them did so nearly identically. How did they know what to do? Feather wearing was introduced as a disguise and specifically connected to the Mohawk Nation. Was the justification or explanation part of legibility or revelatory of an underlying tension inherent in racial impersonation? Disguising oneself as Mohawk connected the reenactor with specific historical facts. What was the relationship between fact and Indian legibility in performance? These questions have helped me identify the practices, curatorial and collaborative, through which redface creates a legibly Indian embodied character in performance, a stage Indian. I will just side note that when I say Indian, I mean a generic, homogenized, racialized figure that is then broadcast or expected to stand in for all Indigenous people. So I use Indian very specifically in this work. I'm happy to talk about Native American, American Indian, Indian, Indigenous, like all of these different terms, if that's useful in the Q&A about why I select the terms that I do. I most often will use Native American or Indigenous or Native, short for Native American, when I'm talking about people who are Indigenous to this continent. I recall my experience in Boston mostly for the unremarkableness of redface. The thing that disturbed me far more than I anticipated was how easy it was, how casual, and how it lived through embodiment, not image. It was bodies, not pictures, that produced and presented the Indian, and it was amateur, impromptu performances drawing on centuries of redface repertoire that enacted legible Indianness. Anyone with a museum ticket could become a stage Indian. In my book, I argue that redface is a collaborative, curatorial process by which audiences and artists construct a legibly Indian body on stage. It is also at its core a process of racialization in the Omi and Winant sense of extending racial meaning to something, some group, or some particular practice that previously was not associated with a race. While occasionally identified with a certain tribe, theatrical depictions of Native Americans repeatedly and routinely flatten Indigenous identity into a single racialized category, the Indian. In the book, I hold on, in one hand, the idea of an Indian as a racialized figure, and on the other, the idea of the Indian as a political project of colonization. The result of the process that makes the Indian a race is that Indigenous nationhood is denied or ignored. That Indigenous nations have the inherent rights that come with sovereignty is not a controversial statement within the field of Native American and Indigenous studies. It is a widely accepted fact that Native Americans are best considered as members of sovereign nations with long-standing relationships and obligations to other nations, land, water, and other than human relations. This seemingly self-evident fact, backed up by centuries of treaties and legal decisions alongside contemporary tribal governments, hinges on the word best. Native Americans have been and are categorized by the U.S. government as nations, as polities with governments and leaders and inherent rights to rule themselves. Native Americans have been and are also categorized by the U.S. government and its citizen as members of a single race. This is the paradoxical condition of being Native American in the United States. Native Americans are configured as one race, Indian, and live their lives as members of many nations with all the variety, complexity, and diversity, and some kind of contention one would expect from across hundreds of nations. There are currently 574 federally recognized tribal nations in the U.S., which does not count Alaska Native or Native Hawaiian. It is in this paradox that the power of redface is most clear. Redface racializes, and in making the Indian legible as a race, forecloses an articulation of Indigenous sovereignty and nationhood. This is not a bug, but a feature. The ideological work of the racialized Indian has been explored by numerous scholars, most forcibly by Philip Deloria's work, incisive work on Plain Indian and the formation of national and individual American identity. Phil Deloria was also on faculty at the University of Michigan for many years, until Harvard poached him. The political work of the racialized Indian is to obstruct, if not obliterate, the ongoing political power of hundreds of Native American nations, tribes, and bands. The stakes of the stage Indian are then quite high. My book, Redface, Race, Performance, and Indigeneity, is an explication of how the Indian is constructed on and through bodies on stage. I articulate how the production of the stage Indian is a production of the Indian as a single and uniform race, and how that racialized figure forecloses conceptions of Indigenous sovereignty, nationhood, and authority. In addition, I offer an embodied rehearsal for my readers to enact what it would mean to read performances differently, to seek out theater by, of, and for Indigenous peoples, not in opposition to redface, but on its own terms and for its own ends. The Indian on the American stage was not invented in America, though it was refined and later exported. European theater, from which American theater in its Western theatrical mode evolved, had been labeling characters indigenous to North and South America as Indians for decades, if not centuries, before the United States was even formed. In 1613, Inigo Jones and George Chapman staged a masque at Whitehall for English royalty that included maskers, quote, in Indian habits, like the Virginian princes they presented, accompanied by torchbearers. So the image on the left is Inigo Jones's drawing as a costume rendering for the Indian torchbearers for this 1613 production. So the torchbearers were, quote, likewise of the Indian garb, while less extravagantly costumed than the Virginian princes or the Virginian chiefs, right, like that's what they were, quote, showfully garnished with several hued feathers. French composer Jean-Philippe Rameau created a 1735 opera ballet comprised of 4 exotic tales of romance, including one set in North America called Les Sauvages, or The Savages, a 1766 production of the opera ballet, which you see in the center, costume designs by Louis-René Bocquet, had the savages without feathers, but with leaves, a weapon, in this case a club, and the implication, if not the reality, of bare skin that Inigo Jones had merely suggested with the white stockings over 100 years earlier. In 1808, the image all the way on the right, the operatic melodrama The Indian Princess or La Belle Sauvage appeared on the early American stage. A musical play about Pocahontas, the performance continued a centuries-long practice of identifying Indigenous people of North America as Indians and depicting Indians as carrying weapons, in this case, a bow and arrows and with feathers. This is actually my favorite Pocahontas play of all the ones. If you want to ask me why later, I'm happy to talk about it. There's a lot of Pocahontas plays out there. In the early 19th century, American audiences and theater artists loved a play about Indians. What is sometimes called the Indian play fad in American theater history occurred from roughly the 1820s through the 1840s. However, this fad did not ever really die down. I'm happy to talk in Q&A if it's of interest. I have an ongoing digital humanities research project that catalogs the copyrighted, performed, or published instances of plays in American theater culture that highlight or include Indian characters. And over several years of research with a handful of research assistants from the University of Michigan have found that this received notion that there was a fad, there was a period of popularity that then died off, is actually not factual. And the persistence of the Indian as a popular topic in American theater stayed pretty steady across the 19th century, and when it started declining in American theater sort of commercial spaces, it actually just moved into different theatrical genres. So I'm happy to talk about that if anybody is interested in that kind of thing later. So all of these Indian plays across the 19th century did contribute to the standardization of the Indian. This is a costume list for a Louisa Medina play, Nick of the Woods, which was adapted from a novel of the same name. The play, this costume list was published in 1868, which was 30 years after the play premiered. Male Indians, I know you can't read this, it's too small. Male Indians were expected to wear an Indian shirt, Indian headdress of feathers, leggings, fringed and ornamented at sides, moccasins, Indian belt, tomahawk, and hunting knife. The suggestions for women are unfortunately much less descriptive, only mentioning one female character, Telly Doe, as often dressed as an Indian girl. Building on this basic uniform from Indian men were additional costume pieces that could be added to signal prestige or leadership among the Indians. So kind of in the middle of the page, again, I know you can't see it, the leader of the Indians in Nick of the Woods is named Wananga, who is supposedly a Shawnee chief, has a shirt, quote, garnished with silver brooches, tufts of hair, and several Spanish dollars. He wears earrings of silver coins and a headdress with beaks, claws, and feathers on it, and wampum alongside his belt. This costume list indicates that not only were there legible costume pieces that indicated Indian to an audience, but that they were so widely standardized and recognizable that no specific instructions were necessary, right? Just go get an Indian shirt. Whatever that is. This is pulled from a female Indian costume list from Nathaniel Bannister's 1844 play, Putnam or the Iron Son of 76. This play was published with this costume list in 1859. So short dress, lots of fringe, moccasins, long hair, headdress, and head belt, and several beaded ornamental pieces. Again, suggesting that there's a standardized look by the mid-19th century that doesn't need extensive explanation, right? What whatever an Indian headdress is, right? Which we actually know what it is, because it sticks around. In an 1898 how-to manual for actors titled Hageman's Makeup Book, published by the Dramatic Publishing Company of Chicago, a chapter is dedicated to makeup for a variety of American character types, one of which is the North American Indian. So the highlighted portion reads, number 17 for ground tone, aquiline nose, wig with scalp lock and eagle's feather, eyes reduced in size, thin compressed lips, lines in combination shades of lake, which is a red, and dark gray with yellow highlights. If occasion demands it, war paint in red, white, yellow, and black. The ground tone, which is something like a base layer, was called number 17, and if you look in the at the end of the makeup book, which is also an advertisement where you could buy these makeups to apply, the number 17 is simply titled Indian. It was Indian color. With instructions as straightforward as this for makeup and costuming, the stage Indian was easily seen on professional commercial stages across the 19th century and in amateur theatrical spaces like schools and community theaters. There are also special guidebooks and handbooks for producing amateur theatricals in high schools or places like that that also include some really interesting costume kind of lists or directions on how to build your own feathered headdress or how to build your own like leggings set. So the visual markers of the stage Indian shifted over time, but routinely relied on feathers, leathers, and face paint. The narrative markers of the stage Indian, the kinds of stories it told, also solidified over time. The noble savage, the vanishing savage, the savage warrior, the Indian princess, the degraded woman, typically referred to with a word now understood to be derogatory, which brings us to the Indian princess par excellence. This is me and Pocahontas at Disney World in Animal Kingdom. Yeah. It was a fascinating moment. In the book, I spend quite some time looking at plays about Pocahontas. There are plenty to choose from, and each offers a slightly different take on the well-known story of an Indian maiden saving the life of John Smith. There are ones where she has a romantic relationship with John Smith. There are those where she has a romantic relationship with John Rolfe. There are dramatic plays, there are comedic plays, there are burlesque, there are operettas. What I found in the 19th century versions of the story was a really interesting insistence on historicity by the playwrights. Many playwrights included a statement or an introductory essay or something like that that described their approach to the historical topic of Pocahontas. Some of them even thanked archivists or libraries for allowing them to access like original documents written by John Smith or things like that. Robert Dale Owen, in an introduction to his 1837 play Pocahontas, insisted that in writing a history of an event, a historian had to be true to their source material, but a novelist, in writing a fictionalized version of an event, must be true to the, quote, spirit of the age, the essence, if you will, of an event. Taking that a step further for the dramatist, or the playwright, Owen asserts that by acting out the historical event in a way that is true to its essence, a performance offers a truthful experience that is as true as the actual event itself. He is claiming that a play about Pocahontas that captures the essence of the story and expresses that is actually a more true or more real experience than even witnessing the historical event, right? Like it feels even realer than if you were standing there watching Pocahontas save John Smith, right? This is the argument that he's making about what is possible for a dramatist that is simply not possible for a historian because they have to follow like the facts. You might, as I did, have a few questions for Owen about this. Who decides what the true essence is? How do they determine that? Owen's explanation of what some would call artistic license is an overt discussion of the way the stage Indian asserts historical accuracy and truthfulness. The stage Indian is used to portray events that are realer than real and are supposed to be understood as accurately capturing the true essence of historical events and people. The veracity of Pocahontas plays is, as you might expect, deeply suspect, and the artistic license that every playwright takes advantage of in writing a Pocahontas play is also the space where deeply suspect conceptions of historical events and Native Americans enter onto the American stage. For the sake of time, I won't get into other Pocahontas-related subjects of the book, but those also include how the stage Indian is gendered and the particular way in which the vanishing Indian trope appears in Pocahontas plays. I will also forego the section on the real-world stakes of using the stage Indian as a measuring stick for faithful Indian essence, as Owen might say, but I'm happy to speak more about that during the Q&A also. What are the real-life implications for Native people who are measured by these conceptions of the stage Indian? From Pocahontas plays, we can learn about how historical accuracy is transformed to truthful essences, which becomes an opening for artistic license and all sorts of racial, cultural, and political ideology. But this faithful essence intrigued me, particularly how it related to the nearly ever-present question of authenticity. What makes an authentic stage Indian? How does authenticity play into American perceptions of Native Americans, and what does authenticity even mean? These are questions I explore in the third chapter of the book, which focuses on two very famous and very popular theatrical performances of the stage Indian, Edwin Forrest as Metamora and Buffalo Bill's Wild West. If you have never heard of Edwin Forrest, that's okay. You don't live in the right century to know him, but he was a superstar. Edwin Forrest was the first American acting superstar. He was incredibly popular, had an incredibly lucrative career, had a scandalous and public divorce trial, and played his most famous role, the Indian chief Metamora, for about 30 years. Though there were plenty of other Indians on hand during the Indian play era, none could compete with Forrest's superstar status or his portrayal of Metamora. Metamora is the title character of an 1829 play by John Augustus Stone that is loosely based on King Philip's War during the 1690s. The Wampanoag leader Metacomet is changed to Metamora, with other historic and artistic licenses being taken. No other actor offered a competing interpretation of the role of Metamora because Forrest owned the script and never allowed it to be published during his lifetime. So there were very few other sort of competing interpretations. Forrest was Metamora. It was the most popular and enduring of the Indian plays in this era. In Philadelphia alone, it appeared in 23 out of 25 theater seasons beginning in 1830. By 1855, over 1 million Americans had seen Forrest perform, though not necessarily in just the role of Metamora. He was known for his dramatic characters. So he played like a King Lear and these like heroic, noble, tragic figures. So Metamora was just sort of one of his stable. He played the role for the duration of his career, and the beloved character became the namesake for towns in Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, about 45 minutes away from here, and Ohio, as well as a steamboat, a racehorse, a fire engine, and a locomotive. Some of those Metamora towns understand themselves to be named after this figure from a play, and some of them do not, although historians tend to believe that they are named for this particular figure. If you want to find the most repeated stage Indian, the most influential performance in red face of the early 19th century, look no further than Forrest as Metamora. Forrest's performance was written about routinely by his biographers as authentically Indian. So the image on the left is the earliest painting by Agate. I'm going to say a very close number to the right number, but I can't remember off the top of my head. Like 1832, so this is right in the first few years when he started playing the role. The image on the right is a photograph by Matthew Brady, the famous photographer in the 1860s, and this was at the very end of his lifespan, just a few years before his death. And the Brady Portrait Studio did a series of him in costume of his most famous roles. So this is him as Metamora. There were also Currier and Ives images of Forrest as Metamora and some other sort of like merchandise kind of things. So an 1877 biography of Forrest, written by William Alger, who was a huge fan, about 5 years after Forrest died, the perception of Forrest's authenticity in this Indian role is quite clear. So Alger says, "Never did an actor more thoroughly identify and merge himself with his part than Forrest did in Metamora. He was completely transformed from what he appeared in other characters, and seemed Indian in every particular, all through and all over, from the crown of his scalp to the sole of his foot." His biographers, Forrest biographers, across several decades, all note how accurate, how real, how authentic his portrayal of an Indian was. More than one mentions specifically that he was so thoroughly Indian that he even breathed like an Indian. That there is a particular way Indians breathed was news to me, though you might be better informed about Indian respiratory practices. Forrest's performance was perceived as capturing just what Owen said a good dramatist could, the faithful essence. However, more than just audience misperception of Indians was happening in these moments. Forrest also explicitly and overtly, and his biographers and scholars followed, linked his portrayal of Indian chief Metamora to a specific Native American. Forrest claimed to have spent the summer of 1825 living among the Choctaw Indians in Louisiana, doing something like ethnographic research. He said he was living with his friend, Choctaw Chief Pushmataha. He also claimed historical knowledge through reading books written on the subject of King Philip's War. So Forrest's biographers, historians, and scholars of American history and culture have repeated those claims to ethnographic knowledge for over a century. I don't know if you're familiar with the field of history and historians, but Jill Lepore has written about Forrest and his relationship with Pushmataha in her book on King Philip's War and how that has come up in American culture. The most recent scholarly book that I know of that directly links Forrest to Pushmataha was published in 2012, so relatively recently. By living with Choctaw, Forrest claimed to have learned the external and internal life of the Indian. They're very explicit about the internal life too, which he was then able to draw upon in creating the character of Metamora. Forrest was equating one Choctaw leader with a Wampanoag leader. He was saying that if you know one Indian, you know them all. This is a racializing assertion. Wampanoag and Choctaw are not related linguistically, geographically, politically, kinship-wise, like they're not the same. So Forrest is connecting a specific human being, Pushmataha, with a racialized caricature of the stage Indian. He was not portraying an authentic or even an accurate character of a Wampanoag chief. He was making a claim to know what made an Indian and convincing his audiences, his biographers and historians and scholars that his criteria for Indianness was correct. Claims to authenticity are always claims to authority. Besides the homogenizing action of Forrest's performance, the covert assertions to determine what makes an Indian and the explicit linking of the stage Indian to an actual Native American, Forrest also lied. He never knew Pushmataha. The historical record indicates he did leave New Orleans, where he was working for a theater company during the summer of 1825 for several weeks. No one quite knows why he left. Some people say that it was because of a girl. Some people because it was his professional career. Some people mix those two and say it was a girl in the theater where he was, but nobody really knows. But they do know he was in New Orleans, and then he left New Orleans for a period of time over the summer. It is possible that he lived among a Native American community for several weeks in the summer of 1825. That community could have been Choctaw, though it could have been a different community whose names sounded very similar to Choctaw. There's several other tribes in that region that sound a little bit like Choctaw. But it most definitely could not have been Pushmataha that he knew in the summer of 1825, because Pushmataha died in Washington, D.C. on a diplomatic mission in December of 1824 and was buried in the Congressional Cemetery with military honors for his service as a brigadier general in the U.S. Army in the War of 1812. His funeral was covered by the press and was attended by then not yet President Andrew Jackson, and received military honors. So this is a copy of Pushmataha's portrait in his later years in his uniform. And this on the right is his tombstone in the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. from when I went to pay my respects this April. It's still there. You can go see Pushmataha. Forrest did not know Pushmataha, and he falsely made this claim to bolster his own claims to portraying an authentic Indian. Again, for the sake of time, I won't go into the Buffalo Bill's Wild West sections of the book. However, suffice it to say that claims of authenticity are always present in the racializing practice of redface, and the evidence used to support these claims, like the evidence Forrest used to support his, always point back to American dominant culture as the rightful arbiter of Native American identity and the only correct source of truthful knowledge about Indians. Sometimes, as in the case of Buffalo Bill's Wild West, the bodies of Native American performers themselves are used as evidence of the authenticity of the highly mediated and racialized stage Indian. From the visual markers of the stage Indian to the narrative markers of the stage Indian to the gendered aspects, the real-world implications, and the constant claims to faithful essence and authenticity, the stage Indian has grown into clearly delineated, easily understood figure connecting the racialized and stereotyped Indian to the lives and experiences of Native Americans. It is an efficient way to tell certain kinds of stories and shows up in many places across American culture, but also across global culture too. We know redface is a harmful practice. The question I often receive when I talk about it is, how do we fix it? Unfortunately, that's easier said than done. In 1946, the Irving Berlin musical Annie, Get Your Gun opened on Broadway. Is anyone familiar with this musical? Okay. It is a highly fictionalized account of real-life sharpshooter Annie Oakley's life. Annie Oakley worked in Buffalo Bill's Wild West, and the musical tells the story of her discovery by Buffalo Bill Cody, her romance with fellow sharpshooter Frank Butler, and her professional and personal trials and tribulations. It is a classic girl meets boy, girl loses, girl gets boy, girl loses boy, gets girl gets boy back story, musical happy ending. Not really tap dancing, but that kind of thing, right? It's just set in a Wild West show, which of course means Indians. The images you see on the right are from a number at the end of Act 1 in the 1946 production. The woman in the blue dress is Ethel Merman, a superstar of the musical theater stage in her own right. Merman played Annie Oakley. Sitting behind her is the character Sitting Bull, based on the historical figure, in a red feathered robe. She is joined by members of the ensemble dressed as Indians and performing a comedic number, I'm an Indian Too, the song. The song is the last moment in a substantial sequence of Indian-themed songs and dances at the end of Act 1. The reason for this spectacle-driven sequence is the plot point where Sitting Bull ceremonially adopts Annie Oakley. This provides a reason for Sitting Bull to financially invest in the Wild West show, paving the way for the action in Act 2. It's pretty important. The images might be uncomfortable for you to see, offensive, even shocking, cartoonish, lots of adjectives you could place around these. These were Indian costumes on the Broadway stage about 80 years ago. To say this show trafficked in the stage Indian and reductionist racist representations of Native Americans is an understatement. To say that it is a widely known, deeply beloved show in the American musical theater canon is also true. I was in a production of this in the early 2000s, wearing a feather headband thing and fringe dress, and yeah, you can ask me about that in Q&A. So it might come as no surprise that a Broadway revival of the show opened in 1999. The image on the left is from a print advertisement for the show. It is the character Tommy Keeler. Tommy Keeler was invented to fix the show's red face problem and was just one of the methods that the revival's creators used to address their Indian problem. So I call this 99 production a revisal, which is a term within sort of musical theater history and studies, because it is so heavily revised that it's not really the same thing, but it still tries to connect to the original. So it is a revisal is the term for it. I devote chapter 4 in my book to this musical and its two main Broadway productions. There was also a revival in 1966, but it made almost no changes, so it has far less to tell us about what fixing red face looks like. What I found in closely attending to the 1999 highly revised version of the show was a good faith effort and removal or addressing of the inherent racism of the original, coupled with a complete misunderstanding of what red face is and what it does. This led to the many changes implemented for the 1999 version to actually reinforce the racialized Indian and to recirculate the stage Indian. Because the creators of the 1999 production thought the problem with red face was that it was a negative depiction of Indians, they put a lot of effort into making positive depictions of Indians. What they did not understand was that the root of the problem is the Indian itself. The Indian is a racializing project that creates negative impacts for Indigenous peoples. So they kept the Indian and the racializing project while trying to fix the racism. Their good faith efforts to make the show less racist included cutting the Indian sequence song and dances at the end of Act 1, including the song I'm an Indian Too. They cut jokes that laughed at Indians. They removed the opening number that talked about Indian attacks on settlers. They changed many of Sitting Bull's lines so that he would sound less like what linguistic anthropologist Barb Meek calls a Hollywood Injun English, and more like the other characters in the show, more standard grammatical structures. They did not use red body paint and cartoonish costumes for any of the Indian characters. They inserted dialogue on more than one occasion to demonstrate how racism against Indians is wrong, and the main character, Annie Oakley, is definitely not racist. But they also inserted new material that undercut all of those efforts. The biggest problem they made for themselves appears in the character Tommy Keeler. In the original 1946 version, Keeler existed as part of the juvenile lead subplot. So he was the nephew of Buffalo Bill in love with the teenage sister of one of the main characters, Dolly Tate. Their romance mirrored the romantic story of Annie and Frank. It was cute. It was pointless. It had the most forgettable song in the show. The subplot was cut for very good reasons because it really didn't add much to the show for the film adaptation and then the 1966 Broadway revival. Tommy Keeler and the juvenile lead subplot returned for the 1999 revisal, but now Tommy was half Indian, a fact that is used repeatedly to describe the character, and a fact that rests on the idea of a racial essence that disappears over time and through interracial relationships. It is a literal depiction of the vanishing Indian. The romance between Tommy and his love interest, still the younger sister of Dolly Tate, is an opportunity in the revisal to show that Dolly is racist because she doesn't like Tommy precisely because he's an Indian, and Annie Oakley is not racist because she supports the interracial romance. Tommy is never connected to a specific tribe or indigenous nation. He is also constantly wearing a headband, long black hair, and inexplicably wears his shirt unbuttoned or no shirt at all. With Tom Wopat of Dukes of Hazzard fame starring as Frank Butler on Broadway, it's quite surprising that Wopat's shirt was more modestly buttoned than Tommy Keeler's. The advertising image you see actually sexualizes Tommy's character even more than on stage, where they do a really Freudian thing by making him not a typical performer in a Wild West show that you would assume a Native performer would have. Historically can prove the kinds of jobs they had in these, like a cowboy or cavalry officer, or a like an Indian that fights or does races, or there's all sorts of things that they could have picked that like legitimately exist as an option for a Native performer, but instead they picked a knife thrower who's in love with and throws knives at his young white female assistant. I'm not sure the logic of relying on tropes of sexualized violence against white women is the best foundation for a cute romantic subplot, but that's what they picked. Nor do I excuse the connection between violence, or should I say savagery, and this half-Indian character. Tommy Keeler is what in academic conversations on racial representation is termed as a hot mess. His character is constructed on the foundation of a racialized, homogenous, violent, gendered stage Indian, making him a sympathetic character, a charming youthful romantic lead, a really good dancer, and unbuttoning his shirt does not undo the red face. It just makes it palatable for turn of the 21st century audiences. In the final moments of this talk, which is thus far focused on the argument I build in my book about the techniques, the consequences, and the challenges of red face, I wanted to turn your attention to a different part of the book, an essay titled Hinoshi Inla, which means a different path in Choctaw, which is my ancestral language, the language I introduced myself in. I am a learner, not a very good speaker, so don't ask me hard questions. I can say my chicken is cold, and I'm hungry, and it's sunny outside, and things like that. This book is about how red face is not just a representational practice, but a reading practice. Without the audience successfully identifying which characters are Indian, the performance of the stage Indian would fail. Audiences also use their own techniques and knowledges to determine who is an Indian, and they are taught and rehearse these skills in the theater and in their everyday lives. This is just the way things are right now. I offer this essay as a rehearsal of the way things might be. Hinoshi Inla explores how Indigenous people use theater and performance. It ranges from contemporary examples of Native American playwrights and the plays they are writing to early 20th century popular entertainer who didn't fit the red face mold, which caused American audiences to misread him as not authentically Native American and for many years as not Native at all. It also shows how Indigenous people have used performance to communicate their experience of American racism and colonialism and have launched critiques of American attacks on tribal sovereignty. That last sentence refers not to 21st century Indigenous playwrights, but public lectures performed for paying audiences by William Apis, sometimes called Apes, who's a Pequot, a leader in the 1830s who advocated for Wampanoag sovereignty. Indigenous people in America have participated in American theater culture, created their own performances to serve their own purposes, and developed their own voices and techniques as artists for as long as red face has been in circulation. Red face is not the only game in town. There has always been another path. Because the challenge of fixing red face is full of labor and discomfort and intentional choices to use your knowledge and skills as audience members in new and different ways, I wanted reading Hinoshi Inla to feel like fixing red face. The essay is interspersed throughout the book, a page or two here, a page or two there, without a seeming rhythm to why and where it appears. There is a reason, but you can talk to me later. It's on dark paper, so it looks like this, on this grayscale. And at the end of each pair or page, there is instructions on how to get to the next spot. The reader has to choose to follow that path and keep making that choice to see how it can be a rewarding path. It takes work, but it should also be a pleasure, because turning our attention to Indigenous plays and characters rather than red face and the stage Indian means turning our attention away from something shriveled and thin to something vibrant and complex and beautiful even when it's painful. Red face cannot offer truth, and trying ourselves to it limits the stories we can experience and the stories we can be part of. Let's try taking a different path. Yakoki. Thank you. We have plenty of time for Q&A if that is of interest to people, but if you have 7 o'clock dinner reservations somewhere, you should go eat. But yeah, I'm open to questions if there are any. We do have a microphone, so we'll ask you to use that for recording and live streaming purposes, so it helps them hear.
You haven't talked much about television. I've been watching Reservation Dogs. How would you put that in the scale you're talking about?
Yeah. I don't focus on television in the book since it's about theatrical history, and I'm really interested in live performance and what the specificity of live performance, like what that gets us. But I would say that Reservation Dogs is both, it's both an achievement and it's also a response to achievements that have come before, right? Like sort of the history of the development. In around the late 1960s and in the 1970s, there's a real shift in American representational practices of Native Americans, right? We move from early 20th century cowboys and Indians, the Indians are the bad guys, they're always attacking, which historians and performance scholars point really directly back to Buffalo Bill's Wild West, right? Like these Wild West shows sort of set the tone for how these stories and how these practices and performances like work, and then it got exported or imported into early film from there. Then we're also having radio, and then we're also television, and then the Western genre. But there is this really big shift that happens in the 1970s, basically. In theater, it gets marked in 1969 with Arthur Koppett's play Indians, which is then adapted into the Robert Altman film, the one about Buffalo Bill Cody, and it has a really long name, and I always forget it. Something, and Sitting Bull, something. So there's this moment where we shift into what I like to call the sympathetic Indian, which is a much kinder and gentler character that starts to be used to as a window into critiquing or processing American trauma and history and guilt, right? Like that starts what it to be. The Indian starts to be turned as a critical mode on America. It's still red-faced in this moment, though, because it's still flattening, right? It's not actually interested in Indigenous people or stories. It's interested in what it can say about America, which is really what the cowboys and Indian stories too are. Also, it's about Western expansion. It's about settlement. It's about appropriate forms of American aggression and when it's right to kill the bad guys, right? Which is a little bit different than earlier 19th century, which was much more interested in Last of the Mohicans, right? A kind of romanticized version of the Indian that's not always the enemy that Wild West show does. So there's a sympathetic version of what I would call red face or the stage Indian in film in the late 20th century, but at the same time, and we see this in theater and in film, there is starting to be development of Indigenous artists working in these mediums, right? So Native theater is often pinpointed to start in the 1970s in Canada and the US around significant plays and playwrights that get produced, that get some notoriety. They get some scholars write about them. They become a thing, and then and so you have these histories. So that started happening in that same time period too. So then you get to late 90s. Smoke Signals was the first, right, independent film, Indigenous-made, Indigenous-led adaptation of, I'm blanking on his name, Sherman Alexie. I was like, something. Of Sherman Alexie's work, and that was the first thing that people started holding on to, is an Indigenous representation of Indigenous community. And it's an okay film. It's not amazing, but it was really something. Sundance has its Indigenous Filmmakers Initiative that's been ongoing, right? So there's become some infrastructure that builds. So then the 1491s come along as a sketch comedy troupe in the early 2000s, early teens, right? And they build a following because of their YouTube kind of presence and the short video sketches. If you're not familiar with the 1491s, I mean, it's like SNL but Indians, right? So it's all Indigenous group of men who are making fun of the Indian. They have an entire video. One of their earlier works has the soundtrack I'm an Indian Too. This song from Annie Get Your Gun that lists all of these really ridiculous and offensive faux Indian names, and that's the background as they go around Santa Fe Indian Market and interact with people about what this expectation is for this Indian figure. So they're working And they are multi-talented artists in a lot of different ways, right? And Sterling Harjo, who creates Reservation Dogs, is from that. Many of the writers for it are also in 1491s. So Reservation Dogs is sort of a culmination of several decades of infrastructure and network and development of artists within the film and television industry. They were here in Ann Arbor in January, February. They gave did one of the stamps lectures. Not Sterling Harjo, he's hard to get now because he's pretty busy, but some of the other members of the 1491s, and they were talking about this process and being brought on as writers, and how how that show is award-winning, it's excellently written, it's filmed in Oklahoma, it's really centered in Oklahoma, native life in a way that's like never been done on that scale before, right? So I put that in a really different category than Stage Indian and even like Robert Altman's film, which is very sympathetic to Indians, but is actually not interested in Indigenous life as the thing that we're looking at, right? So I'm pretty attuned to the dramaturgical structure of the narrative, right? Like how are the different components being used? What are their functions? How are they put together? And so I think when you look at those structures for Reservation Dogs, it's doing something totally different than the Daniel Day-Lewis Last of the Mohicans or Kevin Costner's work, right? Like that's Dances with Wolves is a totally different kind of thing. It's actually not interested in telling an Indigenous story of Indigenous life. It's interested in telling a story about how an American falls in love with the prairies and the expanses and like what does it mean to belong to those kind of things. Does that kind of get at what you're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it deals with people. It gives you
Right.
the lives of real people.
Yeah. It makes Indigenous people
in a
actual
specific
characters.
Place.
Right.
And I find it really fun.
Yeah.
Really good, interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in contrast to like Tommy Keeler in Annie Get Your Gun, whose entire function in the show is to show the audience that the production isn't racist. Like that's its job. Like Tommy Keeler exists to prove that Annie Oakley isn't racist and the show isn't racist and the show is respectful of Indians. And so it's actually not taking him seriously as a character, right? And Reservation Dogs is taking seriously Indigenous lives and Indigenous like relationships and communities and things like that. Yeah.
Thank you. I actually did like Smoke Signals. I was, I moved to Ann Arbor around the time that it came out. And one of the reasons I liked it was because it not only was a little bit more realistic and it looked at reservation life currently from the perspective of, people living on the reservation. But, when you're telling a story, you always think about like people becoming emotionally interested and invested in the characters, that they're real people. Like this young man trekking all the way to Arizona to collect his father's remains when he had such a contentious relationship with his father. His father had his own demons to deal with. And at some point, as much as of a monster as he was to his son and to his wife, you kind of felt for him because he had such horrible demons of guilt, just tremendous that overcame his, his existence. So I kind of liked it. I always look for stories where, you can really, even if you don't agree with the character, you kind of become emotionally invested. So as a storytelling, I thought it showed them as more three-dimensional, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to agree with me. That's how I felt about the movie, though.
Yeah. Yeah.
But,
no, I don't dislike the movie. It doesn't meet sort of contemporary expectation for production values and execution that sometimes it gets dinged for. Like, it has bad wigs. And so that's something I
that scene with Adam
see.
Beach at the end after he cuts his hair. Like,
because he didn't want to cut his hair in real life, and so they rigged him.
Right. So it just looked kind of.
Yeah, there's some things like that that we're like, yeah, it's still independent film, right? It's not that,
right.
But one of the things, what you're talking about, is one of the reasons why it was so important in the development of Indigenous cinema, is because it's a contemporary story, and that's so key. Like everything I've talked about, the Indians are like squarely in the past. right? And that's another thing that shows up a lot, is the historicization of Indians, right, as the thing that was then but is not now. And so things like smoke signals and things like reservation dogs that tell stories of now have been really, really influential in opening up space for Indigenous artists to tell stories about real humans doing real human things, and for like working against preconceptions of when Indians are, right? And so that is another thing that Smoke Signals did that was really important in that moment, is just tell a story about people being like normal humans now, right, in this time period. And so like those kind of questions of when and where Indians show up in film and television is always ongoing. I have not seen any of the various iterations of the Yellowstone franchise, but that is another one that actively incorporates Indigenous characters, and I've heard is okay at it, but also puts them in the past, right? Like, this is a thing that has happened, it's not a thing that is happening. We also displace Indigenous characters in other spaces. James Cameron's Avatar is Dances with Wolves in Space. And so how those things happen. So we still actually really like these stories. We just have sort of polite ways of retelling these stories that can back off of the sort of racist history, but it's still doing the same thing.
Well, and Avatar, I see it as, he may be a great storyteller to a lot of people, but I see it as like combining Indian with Indian, Vedic mythology and Native Americanism. I'm just kind of like, I'm not saying they have to totally be separate, but I'm looking at it like you're just mixing us all in, like we're, a bunch of ingredients or something, I mean, this isn't a casserole,
There is a really interesting move that I've noticed in film in the last, 10 years or so, that does exactly that, right? Like there is a sort of dominant culture, and then there is a minority culture, and everything that marks the minority culture as minority is kind of just a buffet of non-white, non-Western. And so I'm thinking of one of the, maybe 10 years ago, adaptation of Peter Pan. It was like Peter Pan and Wendy. There was like a new live action Peter Pan film. And so like, what do you do with the Indians in Neverland, right? Like, this is the perpetual question. Like, what do you do with Tiger Lily? And it was what you would consider a multi-ethnic, multi-racial community that weren't Native American Indians, right? Not the feathered headdresses, but this like varying community that didn't have any ethnic or racial homogeneity within it, and also mapped onto some things that were like Indian subcontinent at the same time. Right. Like, this is so it's a really interesting move of like what's just like non-white, non-Western, and that's the thing, which Avatar is that, like, always
Yes.
From the plants that are like identifiably sort of South Pacific to the anyway, there's
I just recognize some of the storylines from, because that's my background, South Asia, like, I mean, not only personally, but academically.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of like, where did he come up with this? But anyway, but the other thing was, I haven't read your book, obviously, not yet, but I like that you focused on theater, but did you ever, in your research, are you ever looking at, or will you ever look at, like, how the theater translated into when film started, and how, the treatment of Native Americans in American live theater in the early and later 19th century, how it translated into when the film industry started to develop at the turn of the century, and then further in?
I don't do that work because I know people who are, right? Michelle Raheja wrote Reservation Realism, which is about Native Americans' employment in film and early film, and what the possibilities were available to them and what kind of was foreclosed. Liza Black just came out with a book a few years ago. I think it's called Picturing Indians, which is that it also expressly follows Native Americans who were performers in films across like the mid 20th century, and thinks about their own potential for agency inside of that system that's also always presenting them as the savage warrior or something. Dustin Tamakera is a scholar of television and film who has done some recent work on actually early Indigenous filmmaking, filmmaking that was happening in Comancheria in the Comanche Nation in Oklahoma in like the 1920s. So he's written some about that. So there's sort of a set of scholars who are actually like already doing stuff in film, particularly early film. There's also a book, I can't remember who it's by. There was an Indigenous-led film company in the early teens and into the 20s. I'm going to say the wrong name, so I'm not going to like mess it up. But there's a book about that. There's a man and wife, a Native couple who had their own film company, who like wrote and produced their own films and had a series of those happening in that like early moment too. So there are people who are telling this history that's more complex than we assume that it is, right? There's also the things about Buffalo Bill's Wild West show getting filmed in some of the early film options, which it did not do well in the box office. Like, it was not a good idea. They thought it was a good idea, but it wasn't a good idea. So there was this direct importation of like the Wild West Indian narrative and casting and costuming. At the same time, there was actual like Indigenous artists doing other things with film. It didn't take too long for Hollywood studios to figure out it was cheaper to just dress people up like stage Indians and film them than to hire actual natives. But there was a time in really early cinema where there was a typical practice to hire real Indians to play Indians, which also directly comes out of Wild West shows. Like, that was the hiring practice in Wild West shows that imported into early film, but then within a decade or so, like, it's just cheaper to put a wig on people and makeup, and so it becomes less and less important across the 20th century till you get to mid-century, and it's pretty stereotypical in sort of all ways, narrative and casting and costuming. So yeah, those are some names of people who are kind of already there. So because of that, I'm really more of a theater and performance person. So I say, like, go read Liza. Like, her book's good. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for this really great talk. I'm going to purchase your book if they don't leave before I get out there. Okay. First, I wanted to say that Disney is still doing that. Animal Kingdom, I went with my niece who wanted to see Moana, another Indigenous woman, and we had to go to Animal Kingdom to see her.
All the Indigenous people.
So
are in
I
Animal Kingdom.
I'm sorry that I participated in that. But I was wondering if you could share your experiences both at that Disney moment, but also with the play Annie Get Your Gun, and how that impacted you.
Yeah. So the Disney was a family vacation. My parents' 40th wedding anniversary, all the kids and grandkids, we all met them at Disney World and spent a week together. It was a lot of fun. It's very tiring. And I was actually writing my dissertation. I was still in grad school then, and found out that there was going to be a Pocahontas meet and greet opportunity in Animal Kingdom, and so I basically forced my family to go to it because I was like, I got to see this. Like, what is happening here? If you've been on those like photo ops with Disney characters, they're very short. You don't get that much time with them. So there were pictures with me and my sisters and my nieces and my daughters, and then I insisted on having this one like by myself. And so I told the woman who's like, a Disney cast member who has to stay in character. That is her job, to stay in character. And I said, I am writing a dissertation on Native American representation and performance. And she looked at me and she said, something like, that's great. My father, the chief, will be so interested. And I thought, this is amazing. I don't even know what's happening. I don't know what you think is happening. I know what I think is happening, but I also don't know enough to know what's actually happening, right? So I'm asked, like, does she identify as Native? If she does identify as Native, what does that even mean to her? Does she not identify as Native? Does she identify as a minority? Is a minority enough for Disney to be like, yes, you are allowed to portray this character because you are part of minority? I don't know. The costuming is not the costuming in the movie, right? So it's not Disney Pocahontas look, but it was also January, and like, it gets a little bit cold in Florida in January, like a little bit. So she couldn't wear the like one shoulder thing. And so I was just fascinated. Like, what is on her dress? How is it made? She had these like little bits of kind of stone bead in her hair and this like really long wig. I just thought it was fascinating, and still I'm like very confused by what was happening, because she's playing a Disney princess, but the Disney princess is at least trying to touch a real human, but actually not really that closely trying to touch a real human, really trying to touch the myth of the human that then was mythologized by Disney, right? But there is this assertion of an origin point of the real Pocahontas that then authenticates or gives some sort of authority to this kind of story. So I don't know if that is like the answer you're looking for, but I think it's just weird, like these weird moments. So at the beginning of each of the chapter, I have a weird moment that I've experienced, right? Like it's weird to go to Boston and be handed a feather and be like, this will disguise you, as if one feather could disguise an entire human, right? Like it's not a disguise, but what is it then? So I don't actually talk about my performance in Annie Get Your Gun in that chapter, but yeah. So I was a musical theater major in college and performed at a regional theater company in the summers for a couple years as like an ensemble member. Like I got paid to sing and dance and tap dance. Like that's what I did. I was a singer who moved well, so I was not actually one of the lead dancers ever. But I got to wear a mic because I was a singer. That was my like thing that I did. So yeah, like it was a few years after the '99 revival came out, and so there had been increased national attention on Annie Get Your Gun. So this regional theater company in the middle of the country decided, let's do Annie Get Your Gun. There's interest, people like it, people know it. And so they actually decided to license not the '99 version, but basically the '66 version. So the '66 version follows the film adaptation pretty closely, which cut the leads a little bit. Again, it was a good choice to cut them. As someone who watches a lot of musicals, it was not helping the show really. They also added a song for the film that got made into the '66 version. So we're doing the entire Indian sequence at the end of Act 1, and you know, the guy in full white body paint and a loincloth and a headdress is dancing on a giant drum at the opening of the sequence. There's this ceremonial chant, which I, for the book, was able to talk to two Dakota language learners and say, okay, this is supposed to be a ceremony of adoption. Is any of this real? Like anything? And both of them looked at it and said, you know, like this little bit here kind of sounds like this little bit here kind of sounds like this, but mostly it's just gibberish. Like it's not really a thing, right? So, but, you know, 20-ish years ago, I'm learning these gibberish Indian words, costumed in a, like, you know, faux leather dress with fringe, wearing a blanket and a wig with like 2 long braids, and doing this whole thing. I mean, like, and at that time, I was really excited to get paid to sing and dance. Like, I was not really thinking much beyond that. I remember the moment in rehearsal where the choreographer, who is now deceased, who was fantastic to work with, sort of stopped us in the middle of rehearsal and said, what we're doing here is really serious, and we want to take this seriously. And I realized that they were trying to like impart to a bunch of these ensemble performers who were basically between 18 and 25, all just really eager and excited that they got to get a job, right? Like that summer performing, that we were trying not to be jokey or make fun of or make light of this sort of Indian thing. And I remember just thinking that was a weird moment, because I also understood how far away from my reality as like a Native woman who grew up on the reservation in Oklahoma. I mean, like, just like what normal actual life is like, to this thing that we were dancing and rehearsing was just like so far, like it's not even about me. Like it didn't even feel like it was about me. So yeah, like it kind of just sat there in my head for a long time. And as I moved forward in my career and decided to get a PhD and decided to think about these things, now I just think it's really weird that I did that, and that it was there, and that we all did that, and that we all could agree that we were doing it seriously, even at the same time I'm an Indian too, is an ethnic humor comedy song straight out of vaudeville era. I mean, like, that's the mode that it is. Irving Berlin is writing in the mode that Irving Berlin knows how to write, which is this very early 20th century vaudeville kind of mode. And, you know, it's an ethnic comedy song that I'm like participating in a weird way. I don't think anybody knew that I was Native. I don't think that was ever came up in conversation. Nobody ever asked. I didn't volunteer it. It was like I don't know. Like, if it's normal, you don't really talk about it, right? Like that's also part of it. So yeah. So Annie Get Your Gun got produced regionally for probably a good decade after that revival, maybe a little bit more than that too, just because it became popular and people remembered it, and you could license the new or the old version. It is not my favorite musical for many reasons. It has a really good score because Irving Berlin writes really good songs. He's like a good songwriter. So it's got some really great songs, like The Sun in the Morning and The Moon at Night. I Got Lost in His Arms. Anything You Can Do, I Can Do Better. Like, all of these names, like songs that people know. So people do it for the score. High schools and colleges do it because it is a strong female lead. Like, the person who plays Annie Oakley carries that show. And it has a huge cast, right? So if you have 100 middle school students and you want all of them to have something to do, and you've got 20 really good, strong performers who are girls and like 3 who are guys, you can probably do Annie Get Your Gun, right? So for really practical reasons, it got done for a while too. At this point, I haven't seen many people trying to produce it for these kinds of reasons. It's actually really hard to fix. The revisal, it was well received, but it wasn't like anybody's favorite version of it. And so I don't think there's a version that people feel really confident in producing at this point. But it's still out there. And the songs are still in the repertoire. It's just we don't sing I'm an Indian too very much. Yeah. Thank you for coming. I'm able to stick around for questions. Was that a hand or was that a stretch? Was that a hand? Okay.
Thank you again. My question really is, why is pageantry and musical theater so powerful? You know, because I'm thinking of the pageant that occurs at Fort Michilimackinac every spring, which recreates.
I haven't seen it, but I've heard
I haven't
of it.
either. But it's 1763 and culminates in this large Ojibwe Odawa attack on the fort. My understanding is that there's a whole series of communities that really this pageant means, something. They could not give up this pageant. And so I'm not a music theater person but I mean, like, what is it about that specifically that holds so much power? Like, why do people hold on to that? What power rests in the theater that has led to all of these representations being so deeply ingrained for everything from our animated series growing up as children to the Crayola crayons themselves, right? I mean, now I think it's an easier through line to sort of see, but what is it about that on stage or pageantry that it's specific to American culture, I guess,
So that is like the question that every theater scholar would love to have, which is you just ask, like, why does theater matter, right? There's lots of things. Live performance is one thing you're asking about. Pageantry is another thing, and music is another thing, right? Like, they're actually not all the same thing, but they're all really powerful. So music is good at making us feel things, and we like to feel things, so it can be used as a tool. It's also used at expressing things, so it's meaningful. So musical theater gets sort of an extra bonus because it uses sort of multiple tools at the same time. It's a particular genre that people tend to either really love or like don't care about at all. Maybe not hate. It's not exactly love-hate, but people who like it really, really like it. I teach a class on Broadway in American culture, which is all about musical theater, and it's the class where about 99% of the students are there because they really like the subject matter. They really like musicals. I also really like musicals, so it's good. So So musical theaters are kind of its own thing. But the idea that pageantry and that live performance is important and meaningful and somehow holds on to us, and we hold on to it, like that's a thing that happens. As a theater scholar and person who participates in the making of theater sometimes, I think co-presence and liveness are really important and meaningful to humans. What does it mean to share space and time together? That's one thing that's happening. When you do it and you experience it, you hold on to it and understand and process it as like a real thing, right? And so it kind of becomes part of you in a sense. And so then doing it again every year is also doing yourself every year, right? Like it becomes the thing that makes us, the thing that makes us our community versus not that community, right? So it's a way of belonging, it's a way of marking who we are, what we value, what story makes us. So I teach Thomas King, who's a writer who has for decades claimed Cherokee identity, and that has been questioned by some Cherokee, but I like his writing, so I still teach some of his stuff, and he has a book called The Truth About Stories, and he says the truth about stories is that's all we are, and really thinking about how stories shape us, how stories shape how we see the world, how we understand ourselves, how we make decisions, how we have priorities, right? Like this is what we are stories. So stories are powerful, and stories are meaningful, and stories are important, and stories that you tell with your body brings you into another kind of thing. And I think that's part of why it has power, right? So why do sports fans in Kansas City go like this with their arm, right? Because doing that says, I am part of this community, that this community has meaning, we understand how we can participate in it, how we can support it, how we can perpetuate it. By doing it, I am it, right? Like this is the thing that performance helps us do. So a thing like a pageant in Michilimackinac, or I was at a conference last week hearing a colleague talk about the Ramona pageant in California, which is a history of sort of indigenous dispossession through the mission system in California that kind of mourns it, but counts it as already happened, and how that pageant and that story have been dominated by sort of dominant Anglo culture in the area, but also have incorporated local indigenous communities in ways that are really interesting and weird. And so I'm sorry, it's such a huge question. I'm trying to like get little pieces of why does it matter? Why does it matter that we do things? Why does it matter that we do things repeatedly is another question that theater's also really interested in. Like, what does repetition give us? What does repetition, which is the same but it's different every time, and how do we find meaning in that, which allows us to tell stories about things that stay the same and things that change, right? And so, you know, we shoot fireworks off every year in summer. That is a thing we do to mark a particular story about a particular people and to claim us as a particular time, right? It is the 4th of July, it is Independence Day, we are Americans. And then, like, you feel the fireworks, right? You hear them, but they also kind of rumble when it's really loud, and then you're in a crowd maybe, right? Like there's something about doing it together that we find meaning in. So all of that is like a very poorly prepared intro to why performance matters lecture. But it's a great question, right? And this is why finding these spaces where these performances are happening and asking questions about where people are finding meaning in them is really interesting, right? People would really, really like to hold on to Peter Pan. Really, really love that story. I have been in spaces where Indigenous scholars are like, it's not the best story ever. Why don't we just let it go? Like, you don't need a new adaptation of Peter Pan. Like, you just tell a new story, write a new story. But that story is really meaningful to people. There was a national tour of an updated version of the musical version of Peter Pan that was adapted by Suchangu Lakota playwright Larissa Fasthorse, like, in the last 2 years. trying to indigenize it, trying to fix it, right? How do you fix red face in Peter Pan? Maybe you get an Indigenous playwright. I actually didn't get a chance to see this show, so I don't know exactly what she did with it, but it's those kind of things. So those are the kind of things that I'm interested in. Like, why do we need to tell these stories? Why do we need to tell these stories in this time, in this moment? And why do we need to do that together? And what are the stakes of doing that together in time and space? So my book exists because Phil Deloria wrote a book called Played Indian, and there's a section in like the conclusion of that book where he talks through histories of primarily American males who take on Indian disguises or impersonations in order to process their own belonging or identity as Americans, starting with Boston Tea Party, moving through these 19th century fraternal societies that were Indian societies or faux Indian societies, Boy Scout development, sort of hippie communes, tribal stuff in the 1970s, New Age stuff in the 1990s, and spirituality. And at this one point in the conclusion, he says something like, play makes things real, it moves ideas from brains to bodies. And I thought, oh, that's what theater is. It makes it real. It embodies it. It gives it flesh, its materiality, in a way that the image of the attack on Fort Michilimackinac does not live and have meaning in the same way if it's the people reenacting it, right? If it's the bodies and the materiality of it. So there is something really important about the materiality, which is why I tried to write this book about theater, because I really wanted to think about what happens when people are in time and space together, and what does that mean for this creation of the stage Indian, and what does that mean for Native people? Because Native people are always encountered in time and space in reality, right? Like I'm just me in this room. It's not a picture of a Choctaw, it's just me. And what are my expectations for that? What are your expectations for that? How do we navigate those? Does that get anywhere close to your question? Okay, thanks. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it. It's a Wednesday night when it gets dark so early now, right? And you just want to go home and be cozy.
Thank you again.